Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hello, This Jungian Life listeners. I want to let you know about the Philadelphia Jung Seminar. The Philadelphia Jung Seminar meets once a month, September through May, and it's for people who are not necessarily clinicians, maybe just have a serious interest in Jung, maybe you've had some Jungian analysis. You can come join us. The Philadelphia Jung Seminar is where Deb, Joseph, and I met. It's where we started our Jungian journey, and it's a wonderful program that will be mostly online. There will be some meetings in Philadelphia, so check it out if you're at all in the area or you think you don't mind travel. You can go to cgjungphiladelphia.org, and you can even see the syllabus, and I will be teaching dreams in April, so I hope to see you there.
Today, we're going to talk about friendship. Interestingly, this is an idea that's ancient. It shows up in myths, in fairy tales. The Indo-European root of the word for friend simply means to love. So in that regard, friendship could be translated as the state of being one who loves. Jung was interested in friendships. The anima animus has a kind of reality in the realm of friendship. Social scientists right now spend tremendous amounts of time and resources both understanding what friendship is in the modern world and also identifying the qualities that one can cultivate in order to bring friendships forward. And one of the most successful books that has ever been published in the history of American publishing is How to Win Friends and Influence People.
That's true.
It has been successfully in publication decade after decade after decade. So there's something about this topic that we circle around as a species.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And it's
and
interesting.
before we dive in, I know, as I usually do, I want to remind everyone about Dream School. Dream School is our online 12-month program that teaches you how to work with your dreams the same way that we work with dreams on the podcast. It provides lots of information, rich, detailed instruction, suggested readings, but it also provides a really warm community and a chance to be with us live. We each do a live event every month, so there's ample opportunity to come to my dream seminar or to visit Deb in her office hours where you get one-on-one time with her, or go to Joseph's really in-depth Q&A. So go on over to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and check out Dream School.
Yeah. What I'm thinking about is the intro to This Jungian Life says 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, and then our names. Then I'm thinking that is how we started, isn't it? We were all in training together. We were all in the Philadelphia seminar, and for years, and years and years and years. But we became friends. And then I remember you saying after graduation, we have to find, Lisa said, let's find a mutual project. Let's do some things together, have some stuff to do together. And I think that's interesting that it shows the blend of personal affinity and shared activity, shared interest.
Okay, can I jump in then and
You
tell a story?
You can jump in. Go for it.
So the first time I met Deb was at the first meeting of the Philadelphia Jung Seminar held by the Philadelphia Association of Jungian Analysts. It was in September of 2000. And I had just moved to Philadelphia, and I was excited to join the seminar. And I noticed Deb right away because she's so friendly and smart and just personable. No, we were sitting down, and I was like, "That I'm going to be friends with that woman." I've always had a thing where I could sort of tell who I was going to be friends with, and I was like, "Yeah, she and I are going to be friends." And then, we did talk some that day. I remember that. But in subsequent weeks or months, when the seminar would convene, you would run off to lunch with other people. And I would think,
how
doesn't she know that we're supposed to be friends? I was like totally hurt. So it just took you a while to get on board, but you eventually got with the program. And then Joseph joined a couple of years later. I took a year off at one point. And then I think when I came back, there was this new guy in the seminar. And I just knew, like, every time he opened his mouth, I was like hanging on every word. I was like, who is that guy? It's so much charisma. It was so intelligent. And I was just
cute,
like, wow.
And very cute.
Absolutely. Well, that goes without saying. And I was like, I've got to get to know him. So, and the story continues from there. And I'll let you guys tell your version.
It's an interesting thing to try to articulate as to that sort of subterranean vibe that reminds me of the song from South Pacific of some enchanted evening across a crowded room.
You might see a stranger.
Yes, and that there is some sort of intuitive connection. And if you try to think back on what that is, it's, was it some really cool article of clothing? Was it, this person got my joke? I made a funny reference to some Monty Python thing, and everybody sat there except for this one person who got it. And it was like, click.
Yeah.
I think over time, the three of us, sort of gravitated to one another. We got that we had something indefinable, both in common and as differences that attracted us to one another. And I'm thinking too about our friend Bob, and that there were the four of us that went through this process. So in a way too, we helped each other, and we were loyal to each other in the sense of supporting one another, being generous to one another. Training is arduous. We get bumped and bruised and downright wounded sometimes. So being there in some way over time let us trust each other. That if I call Lisa or I call Joseph, you'll be there. Help me understand it. Pick me up, dust me off, and get me back on the road.
One of the things that also I think brought us close together very quickly is that extroverts are very rare in the Jungian world.
Good point.
It is so remarkably obvious, particularly in a group of Jungians, that most Jungians, being introverts, are kind of like unicorns that are wandering off on their own, grazing in the fields. And the 5% of extroverts, have circled into the center of the field and are sharing all of their experiences about grazing and wanting to compare notes. And do you like it over here? I like it a little bit over there. And this reminds me of that. And what do you think of this? And so Jung has a wonderful way of just talking about introversion and extroversion, that the life force of extroverts flows from them outward into the outer objects, which includes people. And in order to be in relationship, we have to re-engage the feeling or thinking level that we've invested in other people. And that's part of feeling related. For introverts, the life force, for the most part, flows internally to the inner representations and even the inner representations of other people. So there's less of a pressure to be engaged. So as well as just being well suited to each other, just to have people that we could sit and just talk for hours about all the stuff that was going on around us, in us, and in the training was rare in that environment, and that similarity, I think, also helped us bond.
Okay, but I'm finding this kind of like fascinating and also really embarrassing, because I just said like, oh my God, it was sort of friendship at first glance for me with both of you. And I noticed you distinctly did not share a similar story. So I'm feeling like I must have pursued you guys. I probably did.
And isn't that, but that's so illustrative of the dynamic of friendship, of the reciprocity. And I think my memories of you, Lisa, really sparked when we were both in training. And we went to that first big interregional conference together. And you were my total major support person. I was so nervous and so anxious, and we had rooms in the hotel right next to one another. And then also there was that crazy dance party where a wedding next door came trooping in, doing a conga line. And so we had this sort of really Dionysian experience together. And I was in awe of the fact that you were doing the training while pregnant, while having a baby, then having two babies. So, I think I might have been slower off the mark, but it certainly happened for me.
Yeah. Well, obviously, because here we are 23 years later.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
But I also think, I'm so glad you brought that up, Lise, is that because of the podcast, which has really like changed my psychological function when the three of us talk, that it's as if we are three voices from a singular psyche. So for instance, when you bring up a topic, it's like, oh, we just fell in friendship love at first sight. It actually feels as if all three of us have just said that.
Oh.
I know that sounds so strange.
Okay.
Oh, it's been spoken. So I'm going to talk about the extrovert thing. Okay. It's as if we've all spoken that. And then Deb's going to talk about the dance parties. And all three of us have suddenly just said that. It's called a participation mystique.
Yeah, okay.
Like what any one of us says,
it's
all
called
three of us
Spock's mind meld is what it's
Spock's
called.
mind meld. Which I think is part of the friendship as well.
So I think what we're saying is that we have lived into an unusual dynamic of friendship over so many years, and given the commonality. But so have many people lived into a dynamic of friendship, of living next door in the same town or the same workplace, but that there is a shared field that might be geographic, it might be a workplace, it might even be some kind of extended family that offers a context, a container within which the personal relationship grows and thrives.
Well, the interesting thing is that this was suggested as a topic. We now have, by the way, a topic suggestion button on our website if you go to the podcast page. So people have always been good about writing in emails or putting in social media, and we didn't have a way to keep it all in one place. So I'm really excited about our new topic suggestion function. It makes it much easier to go back and find. And we were scrolling through, and this was one on the top, but I think it's been suggested many, many times. And I've always thought we should do it because I know for me, one of the things that's interesting is the psychoanalytic literature is full of stuff about your relationship with your parents or, with the parental complexes, for example. That's kind of stock and trade stuff that people talk about when they come into therapy, to the point where it's basically like a meme, it's like, tell me about your mother. Which is important, but I'm here to tell you that plenty of people come into an analytic space bringing friendship difficulties, perhaps more so women, but I'm not even sure I'm prepared to really put that forward. But people have deep friendships that bring them incredible comfort, that are meaningful over the lifespan, and they also suffer when these friendships falter, when there are difficulties or misunderstanding. So it's sometimes treated as a little bit of kind of a side issue in terms of, let's say, mental health. But it's not. It's really a kind of an essential part of being human. And I would dare to say that friendship is archetypal.
I think there's total evidence that friendship is absolutely archetypal. And I think that perhaps in modern American culture, there isn't enough thought about friendship. And so people are often sideswiped when they realize how lonely they are. They've moved to a new city, they've changed jobs where they had built a friendship network, and sometimes it's the sudden absence of friendship that had been taken for granted that puts people into a crisis and brings them to an awareness that friendships are much more important than they had previously thought. And then, as you were saying, disruptions to friendships that we just expect to be there, that they're kind of atmospheric until all the guys show up at the first wedding within the men's group, and it's a bit of a combination of a wedding and a wake, because the guys are lamenting the truth that they're going to see much less of their friend now that they're partnered and married and on the road to have kids.
So it seems to me that one of the components that we're circling around is the container, the context. And you're adding to this by saying it's our life circumstance. That when you're one of the single guys or single women, you have a cohort and you go out and you go to a nightclub or you go hiking or any one of a number of things. And when the life context changes, for marriage, for example, it's very different. Because the person's identity, some kind of social identity or self-identity has shifted from, instead of being a single person, I'm now a married person. So my first allegiance is to my partner, my spouse. And changes even more if you have children, when you have children. Then, whoa, I'm a parent. And that little baby that little tiny bundle who hardly takes up any room in the crib,
The baby's the boss.
is right, and is first in my psyche as a way of me defining who I am. I'm a mother. So no, I can't go out on Friday night.
Yeah, I mean, some of it I think is self-definition and identity, but some of also is just the sort of like the reality. I mean, I think, when the three of us were in training together, we had regular structured contact. And it was actually, I mean, I think it was kind of wrenching when each one of us graduated, because it was, we didn't know, the context had changed. And so I remember, a lot of people have said at Interregional that being in training is better than being an analyst in a way. And I think it's because you have these rich friendships. And so, as we've said before, the podcast in part was just a project to slightly, it provides a structured way for us to be in touch every week. It's sort of, the podcast is like a byproduct. But, and sometimes, friendships don't survive like becoming a parent, but sometimes you develop really rich friendships when you become a parent, because then you're hanging out with the other moms or whatever.
Exactly.
So.
One of the smartest things one of my friends did, who got married and had a kid, is that he invited me to hold a place in his new daughter's life. And it was very, very explicit. He was setting up an estate for her, and he was going to his various friends, and he said, if anything happens to me, I'm going to ask you to help my daughter in this realm. And so there's a group of uncles, basically, that have circled around this little girl now for 7 years, which has given me a place to interact with him and with his family in this new life. And it was just a delight, to be invited and not just evaporated,
So we're talking about the helpfulness of having a sort of structure around a friendship. And I do find this when people come in and they're complaining of loneliness, which is a real issue in our lives. Oftentimes they'll be like, well, do you have friends? Yes, but people are busy, so I might see this friend for coffee, and then it might be another 6 months before I see them again. Versus I have a group that I play poker with every Thursday. So there's a way that structure can be supportive of friendship contact.
And I wonder about depth of structure. I'm thinking about us, for example, in the Jungian training, which demanded so much of our psyches and vulnerability and our complexes and, all of that, versus, and this may be, unfair, but versus a poker group, for example, of, is it really context-driven, and if one person, moves to a whole different area, that you just join a different poker group, versus a depth of connection.
But I think we're probably moving into the differences between male and female friendship.
I think so. Yeah.
It's probably going to be mostly men who have that weekly poker group. But I would say that male friendships might look different than female friendships. But I don't take it for granted that means they're less deep. Because I think that those kind of bonds of affinity, even if there isn't a lot of deep sharing, that they can be very, very meaningful, very meaningful. It might look different from what I'm thinking. For example, my son is 19, and he has this very close group of friends, and they've been friends since middle school. And I really doubt that they sit around and share their feelings. In fact, I can guarantee you that's not what happens. But I have to tell you, they hold each other up. And I've seen them do this for each other when one or the other of them struggles with something big or small. No, they don't. I don't think they cry on each other's shoulders, But one of them, had a girlfriend reject him or something, and the group of them went and somehow finagled to get him removed from class. They said, like, his mom called and he has to come to the principal's office or something, and then like took him somewhere and took him out to lunch or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so it's not that there's deep intimate sharing, but there is a sense of kind of camaraderie, and I gotcha. And I have no doubt that they'll be friends for decades.
Yes.
I can just sort of feel that in their connection. So I think, Deb, we might judge male friendships because we know that in some way they don't look as depthful as the friendships that women generally forge with one another. But I think they can be deep in their own way.
Yes, fair enough. And I should add, as a little sidebar, that my sister has a poker group that she runs and organizes. So, just to make this, not too overly male-female, and yet there are overall and in general differences between male friendships and female friendships, and you were just highlighting some of them with your son. Of men do things, men discuss topics, men get together to play poker or go fishing or watch a football game. It's more sort of one of the descriptions is side by side. And you're right, it doesn't mean that there's less depth, but it is different overall from women's friendships. I just spent a week
I think the man
with
would
two
like to
friends.
chime in on this for a moment. It's lovely to hear people looking from the outside having great wisdom about it.
Okay, man, go ahead.
Just a little bit, not much.
Joseph, we're mansplaining friendship.
You're femsplaining manship. Exactly.
Okay.
And I'm sure everything sounds familiar. First of all, these researchers come in and, they're looking at statistic generalities. And we know that men and women vary greatly on that bell curve amongst themselves and between the sexes. So we, of course, understand that there are some men that have very one-to-one relationships that are highly verbal and highly disclosing. But in generalities, it seems that men have a tendency to have friend groups, and even quite large friend groups. And what I would say is that even though in these larger groups, men may not sit close and across from each other and specifically disclose a lot of information explicitly.
Yes. Oh, that's
but
good.
Men are constantly inferring an enormous amount of information that is not explicitly verbalized. And men will often speak about another person in the friend group with substantial insight, more inferentially, and I think in a sense to protect each other from being ashamed.
Yeah. Oh, that feels just right. Yeah.
So, our friend Bob shows up and all of a sudden it looks like he hasn't shaved in 3 weeks and he looks unbathed. None of the men are going to say anything, but when he steps out for a little while, all the men are going to start talking and wondering, what's going on? Does anybody hurt anything? They're noticing it, but whether or not they're going to go right to the concern is held very carefully in the group, because particularly in men's groups, if somebody feels shamed, it changes their status in the group and may alienate them and make them feel inhibited about returning.
That's perfect, because what you're saying is that men will behave this way in friendships to kind of protect each other's status, whereas in times of kind of distress or stress, the style of women's relational response to that is called tend and befriend, which it's not that men can't tend and befriend, But that is it's generally women who tend to do that. Who will go to the other and are you okay and tell me what
Yes.
happened, and
Right.
and I can say that women often, I'm speaking from personal experience here, can get frustrated when we see a man we care about, whether it's our spouse or our son or just a friend who's suffering or struggling, and you go and you say, "What's going on?" I'm thinking this with my son, like, "You seem a little down today. What's going on?" Nothing. We don't get the kind of disclosure that we're looking for. Like, I want to tend and befriend. Tell me what's going on. I want to listen. I'm not going to get it. Not that every man responds that way, but I'm always looking for that exchange. And sometimes men want to engage in that, and a lot of times they don't, because it might mean this loss of status that you were referring to, Joseph.
A good example of this is my nephew, through marriage, came to stay with us for a couple of weeks. He'd been having a rough time at home, and so we flew him out to Virginia Beach to hang out for a few weeks. And when he showed up, he was so quiet that it was very difficult to discern what was going on. And sitting across from him and asking questions was totally ineffective, 100% ineffective.
Right.
But it was clear that he was upset and unhappy. And it wasn't until I had to take him on a long drive. It was about an hour and a half drive, and it was nighttime. And he was just sitting over in the passenger seat of the car, and I knew that he liked listening to rap, so I'm putting on some Eminem, so at least we have something to talk about. And it only took about 10 minutes.
That's great.
And then he just quietly asked this question and goes, how long do you think that song is? I thought, I have no idea. And then it suddenly dawned on me that he's asking how long it is because he wants it to be over. It was so subtle. So I just turned off the music, and then we just drove in silence. And about 5 minutes later, this hour-long monologue about everything under the sun, what's going on at school, and and his great-grandmother had passed away in his house because that's where the hospice was, and he cried about it, and it's just this tremendous amount of life. And I also noticed that if I mirrored him a little too much, it was sidetracking. So that, and this is some really helpful advice if you got a boy. There's an old skill that all you have to do is repeat the last 3 words that a boy has just said, and that's enough to let him know you've heard him without sidetracking the conversation down a rabbit hole that he's not prepared to go to.
Yeah.
So somehow that came back to me in my mind. So I would just speak 1 to 3 of the last words, and he would go, yeah. And then another 10-minute monologue. It was it was so great. It was so great. I learned so much about him. He had this really cathartic response. And then at the end he said, it felt really good to cry.
Yeah.
Right. It was like, oh, buddy. And sitting there quietly driving, that can't be commented on. It can only be heard.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of this idea of protecting a young man from feeling overly self-conscious or
And
ashamed
overly
that he
exposed.
relieved so much.
Right.
Just holding it in quietly. Yeah.
It's a wonderful illustration, literally, of how side by side can be really intimate, because you were literally side by side in the car, and then you gave him the space to just express what he wanted to express without too much mirroring, which is the difference often with women. Mirroring is face to face. I'm looking at you, mirroring you, showing you that I see you and hear you, and it's very direct. And the emotions and vulnerability and all that are pretty explicit and allowed. And it is often characteristic of men and women, but it certainly isn't limited to men and women. And it's a good thing to keep an awareness of if you want to attune to someone, what's their style.
So while we're speaking of male friendship, I want to go to a very ancient example, and that is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest extant myth that we have. It was written on cuneiform tablets. It's from ancient Sumeria, and Gilgamesh was this great warrior hero, king, and he was kind of full of himself, so he was just creating kind of a mess. He was taking all of the sons, and he was sleeping with all of the women, and so the people kind of complained to the gods, and the gods heard their lament, and they decided to make someone who would be his equal, who could come down and kind of put him in his place. So they created Enkidu, and the myth says, there was virtue in him of the god of war. His body was rough. He had long hair like a woman's. It waved like the hair of Nisaba, the goddess of corn. His body was covered with matted hair like Samugan's, the god of cattle. He was innocent of mankind, and he knew nothing of the cultivated land. So he's kind of this wild man. And he comes down and he challenges Gilgamesh. So I'm just going to read this part of the myth. Then Enkidu stepped out. He stood in the street and blocked the way. Mighty Gilgamesh came on, and Enkidu met him at the gate. He put out his foot and prevented Gilgamesh from entering the house, so they grappled, holding each other like bulls. They broke the doorposts and the walls shook. They snorted like bulls locked together. They shattered the doorposts and the walls shook. Gilgamesh bent his knee with his foot planted on the ground, and with a turn, Enkidu was thrown. Then immediately his fury died. When Enkidu was thrown, he said to Gilgamesh, "There is not another like you in the world. Ninsun, who is as strong as a wild ox in the byre, she was the mother who bore you, and now you are raised above all men, and Enlil has given you the kingship, for your strength surpasses the strength of men." So Enkidu and Gilgamesh embraced, and their friendship was sealed. And then the myth goes on, and they are inseparable. They are always together, and they are very dear to one another. But then one day, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is overcome, and he says, in the first light of dawn, Gilgamesh cried out, "I made you rest on a royal bed. You reclined on a couch at my left hand. The princes of the earth kissed your feet. I will cause all the people of Uruk to weep over you and raise the dirge of the dead. The joyful people will stoop with sorrow, and when you have gone to the earth, I will let my hair grow long for your sake. I will wander through the wilderness in the skin of a lion." The next day also in the first light, Gilgamesh lamented. 7 days and 7 nights he wept for Enkidu until the worm fastened on him. Only then he gave him up to the earth, for the Anunnaki, the judges, has seized him. Then Gilgamesh issued a proclamation through the land. He summoned them all, the coppersmiths, the goldsmiths, the stoneworkers, and commanded them, "Make a statue of my friend." The statue was fashioned with a great weight of lapis lazuli for the breast and of gold for the body. A table of hardwood was set out, and on it a bowl of carnelian filled with honey, and a bowl of lapis lazuli filled with butter. These he exposed and offered to the sun, and weeping he went away. So he goes about this great weeping. So here in this very first myth that we have, there's this central element of friendship, and it begins, interestingly, with a competition. are with a sort of a grappling with one another. And so I wonder what we think about that. Is that a kind of element of maybe of male friendship, maybe of female friendship? Whereas competition what place does competition have in friendships? Any thoughts about that?
One interesting little tidbit, because I'd been reading up on some of the research, is that men don't tend to stand face to face with each other unless there's an absolute crisis or there's some substantial tension that's building. And often when male animals are facing each other closely, you're expecting some kind of an eruption of aggression. So if you go out into public and you see men standing, they tend to stand at a greater than 90-degree angle across from each other. This has actually been measured. It's usually somewhere between about 100 and 120-degree angle because it is such an instinctive intensity naturally builds to actually be face-to-face, which happens so beautifully in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that they're just facing each other, and that alone creates this volcano of competition between them.
Yeah. There is something about grappling. I'm thinking about jujitsu. And, and I've had male clients who engage in all kinds of sports, but the jujitsu is physical grappling. And that there's a whole dynamic of you kind of have to play by the rules, and because you can really get hurt. So there's something where one person will tap the other as a signal of sort of enough.
Tap out. Yeah.
And I'm even thinking about animals and animal aggression of play fighting. But it's a kind of contact, and that allows a closeness while preserving individual autonomy.
If I can amplify that with one quick myth again.
Go for it.
So Aphrodite and Eros give birth. Aphrodite and Ares mate, and they give birth to Eros, Cupid. And in one myth, Eros begins to fail. He's not thriving, he's not feeding, he's not growing, and Aphrodite is distraught. So she goes to one of the great earth goddesses and asks for help. And she says, you need to have a second child. You need to have a second child with Ares. And so she does, and she gives birth to Anteros. Eros meaning love, Anteros meaning love returned. And when the two young boys meet, they wrestle and roughhouse. And in that dynamic love and love returned, that Eros comes back to life and is strengthened and goes on to thrive. So there is the love between opposites, and then there is the love between similars. So yes, that wrestling robustness has a place.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the tapping out and the wrestling, Deb, that you were talking about, the grappling, and how, the tapping out thing is really lovely because it's like we're learning our limits, right? Like, ooh, there's my limit, I have to stop. And of course, that's what dads do when they roughhouse with children, is they take the children right up to the limit and usually right past it. Like usually in a roughhousing session, ends with tears.
Somebody
cries, but it's really fun until then. I remember my son. I remember my son when he was a kid. He had this friend, and I'm thinking they were like 6, 7, kind of in that range. They would wrestle like a couple of puppies for like an hour at a time, usually just laughing, kind of tumbling over the bed, just wrestle. It was so interesting to see, and I guess maybe maybe that is an important element of male friendship, is sort of like, where do you begin and I end, and that sort of thing. Which again, I don't think that's necessarily as big a part of friendship of, say, girls of the same age.
I agree. Boys are not girls.
Have we hammered
That's
that
deep.
home?
That's really
Okay.
deep. I was a nursery school assistant when my kids were in nursery school to help pay their tuition while my husband was in grad school. And there were different corners in the 3-year-old room. There was a car and truck corner, there was a dress-up corner, and there was a doll corner. And it was revelatory to me to see. You almost never saw a girl in the car, truck, vehicle, things on wheels place, and almost never saw a boy over in the doll corner. And both participated in the dress-up corner.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And I had a boy and a girl who happened to be twins, and I was just determined, that they would pick out their clothes when they got to have preferences at the right age, and we were just not going to do this, sort of what a quote proper role unquote is for a girl or for a boy. And oh my God, my girl wanted to wear pink and take ballet lessons, and our son wanted to, roughhouse and dig up worms and all that good stuff.
Yeah,
So,
and,
overall, there just are differences.
Yeah, and I think we're just saying there are differences in friendship patterns. And, certainly some of these differences can be ascribed to culture that kids imbibe even from a very young age. But there does seem to be some real robust evidence that some of it is kind of hardwired. But let's go to a different friendship, shall we? Another example of a male friendship. So Carl Jung read Freud with great interest when he was a young man, and eventually made his way to Vienna to meet the august Sigmund Freud. And so here's a little bit of a description of that first meeting. This is from Deirdre Baer's biography of Jung, which is just called Jung, a Biography. Okay. Jung entered Freud's apartment at Berggasse 19 for lunch at 1 p.m., stayed through dinner, and left at 2 a.m. after a 13-hour marathon of nonstop talking. At 1 a.m., both men looked at the clock and were astonished to discover how much time had passed since they began to talk. A world happened then, Jung told the distinguished Freudian Dr. Kurt Eisler many years later during an interview. Jung compared his day with Freud to the act of giving birth. At birth, everything is already there. In reality, there is no time. Time is nothing. That's what one realizes on such occasions. There are moments that are completely timeless. Yes, he replied in agreement with Dr. Eisler, that was a really intense encounter. And so, whether it was a mentorship or a friendship, there might be room for discussion on that. But it was, in some sense, I think, of great, great friendship, of incredible significance, certainly to Jung. And the men were close friends for a number of years. They took a famous trip together to the United States to give lectures at Clark University. And then eventually they had a very stormy end to their relationship, which wounded Jung greatly and thrust him into a severe depression that he later referred to as his encounter with the unconscious. So this also kind of brings up, something we hinted at earlier, which is, you have these kind of love-hate relationships with friends, and that there's that wonderful term, frenemy.
Frenemies. Yeah.
So Freud and Jung were kind of frenemies there for a little while. So what do we think about that?
Well, there's a wonderful a quote by Marie-Louise von Franz, who is one of Jung's close collaborators, about this sort of love-hate aspect. She says, we make friends with people who live out our shadow. Friends can do the things we cannot do. Tell me who your friends are, and I have the whole panorama of your good and bad qualities. Our bad qualities, as well as our good ones, hold an attraction, a fascination for us. The friend is often the person whom one envies. The friend is more elegant, or dances better, or can move about better in life, or has depth, or has a better mind. So if one hasn't worked on one's shadow, there's always a kind of love-hate relationship with the shadow and with one's friends. I think that adds a really powerful and very interesting element to friendship, and I think it is right there in the friendship between Freud and Jung, of how Jung venerated Freud at the beginning, and at one point writes to him and says, and be like a father to me. Freud was 25 years older, and yet there were differences that eventually couldn't be overcome, and both of them had a kind of rigidity there, and a kind of adherence to their own thinking and their own theory, that the personal relationship couldn't overcome. And don't we see this sometimes in friendships, and people will say, well, what happened? And the hook that the difference is hung on seems fairly small, but it goes really much, much deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've seen, close friendships fall apart even within our community, and how kind of devastating that is, I think, for everyone. It's really hard to lose a friend or have a conflict with a friend. It can really kind of haunt us. I want to say, I love that von Franz quote, and it is helpful to keep in mind when you dream of a friend. The formula, which, of course, it has limited applicability like any formula, but if you have a same-sex image in a dream, it's likely to be a shadow figure. So a lot of times if you dream of your friend, you have to say, okay, so my friend, Suzanne, what part of me is she carrying for me that I have a relationship with, but I haven't absolutely kind of claimed consciously. So I do think that our friends can be a pretty good representation of shadow qualities, and that is something to keep in mind when we're working with our dreams.
I'm sitting with the tremendously unique meeting of Freud and Jung in light of some of the other generalities we've talked about friendships.
Yeah.
The fact that the two men already came so verbally developed, having a language of their inner and outer lives, having a language for their philosophies and concepts, that it afforded them this way of dancing, so to speak, this place for Eros to erupt and sustain. And I think that is a dimension in all friendships that is so, so important. So as I've said in a number of other podcasts, I like to make a differentiation between sex, Eros, and love. And Eros, when it manifests, and it can't be chosen, it happens independently. It's evoked by something intangible between the two people. There is this mounting sense of aliveness and often joy. Just in the presence, in the speaking, in the back and forth, in the dance. And I suspect that was part of what happened with Jung and Freud. I suspect, looking at the story of Rumi, Rumi met Shams. Shams said something that was so theologically profound, apparently, that Rumi fainted. And when he came to, Shams was kind of helping him out for a bit. And the two of them just went arm in arm back to Rumi's home. And they just kind of locked themselves in a room for 30 days of talking, of sacred talk, which in Sufism is called sobet, which is this deep, deep dialogue of the soul. And that lifelong friendship between Rumi and Shams, the incredible power of the friendship between Jung and Freud, comes out of that joy.
I wonder if what we are touching on here is how do friends resolve conflict? And that's what Rumi and Shams apparently never had. And Jung and Freud started out that way too. If they just, in a way, fell in love with one another with these ideas and all that they were each working on, these two incredibly brilliant men. And they couldn't grapple. I'm going back to the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu of can you grapple and really have it out with one another, go toe to toe, and that ability to engage in a conflictual relationship, without going for the jugular, can forge a bond that is even stronger.
Yeah.
And that is what Freud and Jung could not do.
Right. And I mean, you can tell from reading Jung that he was, at least this is what I see when I read kind of the later Jung, and he refers to Freud like 20, 30 years after this event. You can see there's still a complex around it. Because he's fairly generous. He'll give Freud his due, but then he'll get defensive, and you can hear that was a wound that took a long time to close, if it ever did. I just want to say we've been talking about these sort of great friendships like Jung and Freud and Gilgamesh and Enkidu. I just want to give a little shout out for Barbara Hanna and Marie-Louise von Franz.
Yes, perfect.
So I don't know as much about it as I wish I did. I've not read a biography of either woman, but Barbara Hanna was a little older, and apparently Jung told them that they should live together because he wanted Marie-Louise von Franz to understand that you could have a kind of positive mother experience. And so the two of them lived together, I think, for decades and decades, and I believe they're buried together. And
wow.
Yeah,
and Barbara Hanna was quite a bit older.
Yes.
And when we went to Zurich, we were told that Barbara Hanna would sort of stand outside the door while Marie-Louise was having a session and make sure that session ended on time. It was sort of protecting Marie-Louise von Franz.
Well, and you got the feeling there might be some jealousy there, which is a really interesting thing to talk about in terms of friendships, and yeah, I mean, I'm curious about the relationship between them. I don't know much about it, but certainly it was a great friendship, if not also something more. But yes, Barbara Hanna seemed to kind of jealously guard the younger woman. So
let's talk about friendship jealousy, because I think that's not discussed too frequently. I mean, I think we all experience it, particularly if we're in a stage where we're so enjoying a friend that it becomes a bit greedy, and we just want, all the time and attention and all the good stuff, that can come out. And I know I've experienced this and just felt really intensely about somebody interfering with the friendship and really not knowing what to do about it. I think now at this age, I probably would just say, gosh, I feel really jealous about these other people kind of diluting the time. But back in the day, I knew I just felt angry at the interlopers.
Well, and friendship can have this kind of romantic quality, can't it? When you're first friends with someone, especially, you can feel a little, a sort of flutter in the stomach, and even if it doesn't become kind of overtly, sexual, but it can feel a little bit like a falling in love experience. And so when the friend makes plans with someone else, it's like, what? And I think that can be true whether it's between two women, whether a man and a woman, or two men. That it can feel, you can sort of feel usurped, and you want to be first in that person's heart and that kind of thing.
It really goes to such an early developmental stage, of I want to be number one. The old, to call up Freud again, to call up the old Oedipal dilemma of, that mom and dad sometimes prefer to be with each other rather than with me. And horrors, how could that possibly be? And needing the security sometimes of a best friend. Adolescent girls are famous for this, of having a best friend, and you go places together and you discuss, when we go, what are you going to wear? Oh, I'm going to wear this. Okay, then I'll wear that. Of that sameness and being chosen and having that bond that has echoes of the original bond with mom. And I remember having a friend who lived down the street named Sally, and she was my best friend. And so one day I told her she's my best friend. And then she told me that she couldn't make up her mind whether I was her best friend or whether it was Lois. And I remember being absolutely shocked, and then launching a real little campaign to make sure that I beat out Lois.
See, now you know how I feel, Deb, when in the fall of 2020, when you used to go out to lunch all the time with that other woman, and I was like, what's going on? Doesn't she know?
I was inexplicably oblivious to the real dynamics that I should have been paying attention to.
Yes.
So evolutionary psychologists studied this as well, and it was interesting to read a bit that this idea of protecting your best friend happens in other species. That horses, among female horses, they'll choose a best friend, and if another female horse starts to get a little bit too friendly, the more dominant friend will come over and nip them or kick them, get them away.
That's what I tried to do.
Absolutely. Male
get
macaques.
Lois out of the way.
Male macaques will do the same thing. If they've got a best buddy, they're going to snarl away anybody who tries to get in the middle of that. And one of the theories is that, of course, if we have strong, intimate support from a friend, we are more likely to survive, and particularly survive physical attack in the wild, and perhaps even in more primitive circumstances for humans. But also it protects us from reputational attack, which is a really interesting dimension, that if somebody's our friend, we expect them, if they're out in the world and they hear something negative about us, to be like, hey, wait a minute.
Yes.
I have, bum, bum, bum.
Yes. Yeah.
And because we live in such complicated social situations, maintaining a certain level of reputation is very, very important in terms of thriving. And if we discover that a friend doesn't protect our reputation or aligns with somebody who is verbally against us, their stock plummets in most people's estimation.
Yes. Yeah.
So we expect our friends to defend us and protect us, and for us to do the same.
Which is interesting, because that then gets repeated at the international level, right? This kind of very ancient, hardwired, maybe mammalian pattern of forming these alliances and expecting to be backed up. We formalize that in international treaties, and we talk about, for example, the United States and Britain have a special friendship. And, we always know that we'll support the UK, and we expect them to support us, and that has a long history. And so again, just to say it, this is really, really archetypal, and it gets repeated at these various kind of levels of organization.
So let's talk a little bit more about female friendships, since we spent so much time at the beginning talking about these archetypal male relationships. And something that, again, comes out of research is that women particularly sit in this place of cooperation and competition, and that is instinctively monitored in groups of women. So the cooperation in terms of evolutionary psychology makes sense. We know that women who have strong friend groups live longer. Women that have strong friend groups have a greater success rate in raising their offspring, and the offspring themselves tend to be healthier, have more access to resources than women who are isolated and set to the side. But women also compete with each other in a group setting. What do you guys think of all that? Does that ring true? Are the research scientists getting anything right?
I mean, I do think there's a lot of kind of covert competition between women.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it can obviously turn ugly, and it's been immortalized in movies like Heathers, I suppose. Where there's this kind of social aggression that women can enact on each other.
It is covert, and it's not anywhere near as direct as guys banging into one another on the football field or the basketball court, and then after the game is over, we're all friends again. It's very much masked by at least a veneer of being nice. Because women are not encouraged, I think, overall, culturally, to be aggressive physically. And I've seen it just most recently in a granddaughter's pictures of the class in junior high. All the girls are dressed exactly the same. And they all have short skirts and dresses on in different colors, and the competition, this is my imagining here, the competition is allowed in terms of how expensive a dress you get, and whether it has special decorations and so on. But at the same time, you have to be the same, you have to be dressed the same as the other girls, and not be too aggressive about getting way out in front, or being assertive, or taking power, or asserting hierarchy or dominance in an overt way. But it's human, isn't it, to compete, to want status, to claim authority, to want leadership. So it's just a question of style.
So the evolutionary psychologists often bring this down to a kind of survival dynamics. Mm-hmm. One idea is that if a woman has identified a mate and they have a pair bonding and there's either an intention or a production of children, that a woman is scanning for any person, any other woman that might interrupt, draw the mate's attention away, put the children, the offspring at risk, which is something I think when I was young I was really naive to. The first time I had got my social work license, I was just beginning, and a woman had come in and she was talking about having recently gone through a divorce. And so I thought we would just talk about the change and the loss. But what she was really suffering is that how her friends reacted to her had totally transformed. Mm. Again, at first I thought, well, is it because it's a taboo? Is this a religious community? Because sometimes that's, considered a religious sin. And she goes, no. All of a sudden, they're treating me like I'm dangerous to their relationships. Mm. Like I'm the merry widow or the gay divorcee. And I'm going to dance in and dance their husbands off. And if I show up at a wedding and I don't have, an escort to the wedding, I'm literally kind of scorned and isolated, pushed aside. I was so naive to that dynamic. But I think this is real.
Yeah, that women can feel intimidated by each other, and there's kind of an unconscious pact that can go on. There's a way that women signal to each other, and perhaps men too, I'm not going to be a threat to you. And part of the way that women do that, for sure, maybe men do it by standing at an oblique angle to one another, but women do it by sort of, and sometimes it's called fawning. It's like, I'm going to reveal myself. I'm going to make myself vulnerable. I'm going to share something that's really very vulnerable, or I'm going to kind of maybe put myself down. I'm going to make a crack about how my hair looks terrible today or something like that to make myself kind of relatable and not threatening. And then it's like, okay, now I know we can connect. We're not going to be threatening to each other. We're both going to be kind of accommodating to one another.
And does that feel comfortable? Does it feel reasonable when you observe that, or you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the basis upon which many female friendships are formed. The interesting thing is that some women are by nature not that accommodating, and they're not going to be that interested in showing their juggler, as it were, to kind of establish. And I think that I admire women like that, and you can't be friends with a woman like that and be accommodating. You have to present yourself with as much force as the other woman, and then there's going to be a little bit more maybe conflict in the relationship than in the like those two cartoon skunks who say, "Oh, after you, no, after you, no, after you." Do you know that old cartoon? I can't remember if they're skunks or whatever, but it's like, "Oh, no, you go first. No, I insist, you go first." That kind of relationship can work okay when both people are sort of equally accommodating, and it can also work okay when you're Enkidu and Gilgamesh and you're going to stand toe to toe. I think when people orient in different ways, then you can get into trouble because the accommodating person feels resentful, the accommodating person feels steamrolled, and sometimes the person who's not accommodating is like, come on, stand up, get pushed back. So, I think you just there's this kind of testing period. Who are you, and are you going to be accommodating, and do we have the same level of kind of thoughtfulness of one another? So.
I wonder if collectively the scales are really tipping, and we see it in women's sports that are becoming more and more prominent. Women's soccer World Cup people are watching it. We have a relative who coaches girls basketball, and he coaches them to be aggressive. And somebody said, "Oh, you're making these girls," and he says, "No, I am treating them like basketball players." Mm-hmm. And that the terms of engagement, so to speak, are really shifting, which is, no, we're not going to be sweet and dear and accommodating as girls and then women. We're going to say what we want and go after it and grapple.
Mm-hmm. And grapple.
I think there is a real shift collectively, and I'm glad to see it.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's come forward in our fun conversation today is that there is so much to say about friendships between men, between women, and friendships between men and women, which actually we didn't have a chance to
We didn't even really get there.
Talk so much. So I'm wondering whether there might be a series of talks on friendship where we've kind of cordoned off a little smaller area of consideration. In the ancient world, there was an enormous amount of interest in what a friendship is and the Nicomachean ethics. Deciding how friendships work, friendships of utility or pleasure, or friendships based on morality. Cicero wrote about friendships. Modern psychologists write an enormous amount on friendship, and they've identified that proximity, common interests, similarity of personal values, self-disclosure, reciprocity, consistency, empathy, time, all of these things are elements that are naturally part of cultivating and being a friend. And so we started by discussing how we three discovered our friendship and have continued to find opportunities and reasons to creatively interact with each other. And I suppose if I were to leave our listeners with one idea, finding mutual creative purpose can be the sustaining soul of friendships, whether it's a small group of people or two people, and that purposiveness can bring forward so many other dimensions of how we grow, what we learn, what we have to learn, how we shore each other up. And gosh knows there's so many important things that need help in this world. So if we can come together in smaller, larger groups, trying to do something that's good in this world, what a wonderful way of fostering a friendship.
So with that, and before we transition to a dream, I would like to say thank you, as ever, to our patrons and for your friendship. You are special, appreciated, very dear friends. Most of you are unmet friends, but still friends, and you help us keep going. We appreciate your support. It ensures our freedom to just do what comes up that feels real and authentic every week. And we thank you for your supportive friendship.
And a friend out there in the ethers has submitted their dream for us to share with all of you and talk about. This is a fellow who's 31 years old and works as a musician, and he has titled his dream, The Tower and the Tunnel. There is a vast plain with a deep, wide, and steep hole. From the center of this deep pit a high tower stands. A figure physically throws me across the expanse to the tower where I'm suspended against the building. The perspective stays on the figure who's wearing a black cloak that covers their form. Their arms and legs and face and all skin is under this black cloak. There are 2 white marks on the fabric denoting eyes, but they aren't actual eye holes like a mask. They slowly turn and walk off after I've been thrown. The dream then repeats. I'm thrown again, but the perspective follows me across the expanse. The thread I am suspended from is a single piece of spider's silk. Where I am hanging, I am face to face with a guardian of the tower. It is an anthropomorphic lizard, light green, wearing golden armor. It raises its sword, and instead of attacking me, it cuts the silk thread, and I fall in a quick but safe manner. I notice open windows one could sneak into on my way down. Safely reaching the base of the tower, facing underneath where the cloaked figure and I were, I see a large tunnel, and I know I need to enter. I begin to walk towards it when I awake. For context, he writes, I've begun a new approach to my craft as well as lifestyle. I've long been fully transient and recreated music of the 1920s. I recently decided to travel between only 2 towns or regions and focus on original works. His main feelings, he writes, I knew I was in a very special place. The cloaked figure felt immensely powerful, and I felt respect rather than fear for them. The lizard guardian was also noble, but in a workman's way. I felt safe and collected in my fall. There was cool evenness in my temperament throughout. What a spectacular mythopoetic encounter for
Joseph,
this person.
I read this dream this morning and I thought, Joseph's going to love this dream.
Oh,
but
goodness.
yes, it's a really interesting dream. I always guess I get a little bit of a head start since I read it first. Since I'm the dream
Go
picker.
for it.
Well, here's what I thought when I sat with it a little bit, and I mean, I'll just say that we get so many more dreams from women than men, that when possible, I'll go searching for a man's dream just to kind of even it out a little bit. So I was definitely on the hunt this morning for a man's dream. And I think this is a really, really interesting dream. I think the age of the person is interesting, 31. So as we've talked about on the podcast before, it seems like for many people, there's a real shift in the psyche around age 30, where, it's sort of the beginning of, oftentimes for people, it's like, oh, wow, the party is not going to last forever, is it? So maybe I need to sort of figure things out and get serious. So I think that sometimes, this is just the way I think about it, this doesn't carry any particular authority, but, a lot of times in our 20s, we may act like a puer or puella. We may flit from thing to thing. We don't really commit. We fly off here, we fly off there. And actually, that's kind of age appropriate at that stage. If you're 25, to be a dabbler, that's actually fine. If you're a dabbler at 45, that looks different. For a lot of people, and maybe this is kind of close to my heart because this is when it happened for me, I was around 30 when I was like, oh, I get it. You just keep getting older. You know, that the time doesn't go back the other way. So maybe if I want to do certain things, I need to kind of knuckle down. And, you know, that's when my life kind of began to take the form it is now. And I think that that's not that unusual. So I'm focusing on this dreamer's age and the fact that he says he has a new approach to his craft and his lifestyle. And I hear, I'm getting more serious, I'm getting more settled. And that, I think, is what we see in the dream, because there's this image of being suspended. So being suspended is a real image, I think, or can be an image associated with sort of puer psychology. You're just hanging. You haven't landed. You're sort of literally up in the air. But he comes down to earth. He has this kind of somewhat frightening initiation, although he doesn't say he's frightening, but the guardian of the tower, this kind of lizard god, comes and raises a sword. And it's the sword that maybe disconnects him from this puer attitude that he has appropriately held. And now he's going to have a soft landing because he's not at odds with the self. He's open to this, and he's going to willingly go into the tunnel, which would be a kind of potentially, it's an image even of depression or negredo, but it certainly is an image of kind of going in and down and perhaps kind of getting a little more grounded. So I'll stop my monologue now and see what you guys think.
Well, I think, Lisa, my ideas about the 16th tarot key, the lightning-struck tower, is very congruent with his dream and your interpretation, that for the great amount of our lives, we live in something of a tower of isolation, and that can be interpreted in many different ways, whether it's our complexes isolating us, and for some, just the experience of the ego being isolated in some ways has to be overcome in order for us to have a sense that we are part of a larger life, which we could not discern earlier. In that tarot key, there's a lightning strike to the top, and the figures are cast out into the air, and they're crying out in horror. And the esoteric teaching is that they will fall into a fertile valley that is the valley of experience. And they'll begin a journey. So I have that same very positive association with this. I did want to also bring in another mythic dimension to it, that the Greek fates, there were 3 of them, and often imagined as old women spinning the threads of human destiny. Clotho was the spinner. I think I'm going to mispronounce the next name. Laxis was the one who distributed the thread, and Anthropos cut the thread. So this idea of kind of dangling from this thread, the thread of his predestined fate, because in that mythic world everything has already been set out for you, that something has happened in the psyche, and Anthropos has snipped the predestination and set him free to have a different kind of experience. Now, in the external world, it looks like there's been a change, moving from bringing forward 1920s music written by other people and moving towards his original works. I mean, wow, what an enormous snipping of the previous tendency.
Mm-hmm.
And then making a decision about how often and how far that he's going to travel. And I have to say, for musicians, living on the road, which I'm sure is exciting when you're 20, really interferes with creating a home,
Yeah.
or finding a spouse, a loved one, who really can tend home with us.
Or sustaining
So even
friendships.
or sustaining friendships. So just deciding that he's just going to move between a couple of areas which will allow him a way of building a different kind of stability, I think is also part, as you were saying, of this maturational arc.
So let me come in with, my first sort of reaction to this dream that is like a snippet of a myth or a fantasy tale. Sort of sci-fi fantasy of, this incredible setting, the pit with a tower in the middle of it, and then this mysterious black-cloaked figure that can just throw him up against the tower, and then being suspended, and the guardian of the tower is an anthropomorphic lizard, light green, wearing golden armor, and turns out to be a friend in snipping the silk, but our dream ego doesn't quite know in the moment what's going to happen. So, this is a dream that does not really have any personal context. This is all in the realm of the mythopoetic, with pits and towers and tunnels and spider threads and gold armored
Anthropomorphic lizards.
and part of me goes, let's talk a little bit about what's going on more specifically in your life. My tendency is to want to ground this magical, mythopoetic fable in more human, lived reality, which the two of you have pointed to in terms of the transition around age 30, working on his own music, etc. And I am struck in this light by the fact that at the very end of the dream ego sees a large tunnel and knows he needs to enter and begins to walk toward it, that there's going to be a descent. Welcome to the real world. I would be hoping, if this were someone I was working with, I'd be hoping that other dreams would have shadow figures in them. Uncle so-and-so, grandmother so-and-so, my colleague, my bandmate, of things that are not quite so somehow shimmering with archetypal imagery. And I think that is, the telos of the dream is going in that direction.
That's right.
Speaking of the large tunnel, that's going to be dark.
Mm-hmm.
And that darkness is where fertility is. Babies grow in dark wombs. Plants grow in the dark earth. And I would be interested in seeing what this person's dreams look like, several months from now, of where is psyche going down from the heights to the depths.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just want to say one more thing about the lizard is, lizards can be associated with death and rebirth, because when they lose a tail, for example, it regenerates. So there's a little intimation there in the fact that the armor is golden, that this might be... Well, I wonder a little bit about the black cloaked person and the lizard, if they're not kind of manifestations of the self in some sense, kind of forcing the ego onto the next leg of the journey. So, I agree, Deb, it's a very archetypal dream, and it would be interesting to know more about this dreamer and see how these things are seated in his everyday life, as they always are. And sometimes at points of major life transition, we might have very archetypal dreams. So,
one thing we can say about archetypal dreams is that a change is going to happen. A change has already happened in the imaginal world. The thread has been cut. You're on the ground, and there's a tunnel before you. So if we take dreams as the artifacts of something that has occurred,
that's great.
You are in a different place and at the beginning of a new mysterious process. There's also a wonderful dichotomy between the tower, which is phallic, and the tunnel, which is feminine. So you're cast towards this tall tower, and perhaps as you're hung by the thread, you've learned something about the tower and what it might mean. And now you've been set free to explore something about the nature of the feminine within yourself. And midlife is a perfect time for that, to begin to explore something new, a different approach. And even the fact that he's long been transient, and now there's a sense that I'm more interested in home, which is often the realm of Hestia, home, the hearth, the heart, and homemaking, and the value of that in a man who has lived without that transiently is an enormous shift of archetypal priorities. And I would imagine this person is at the beginning of learning how to do that, and the skills associated with it. And the archetype can provide this enormous motivation to figure out and find out whatever is required to have that for yourself.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.